Final Fantasy XIII is one of the more polarizing entries in the Final Fantasy franchise. Players either love it or hate it, with very little room for a middle ground. Now, my opinion is going to be based solely on the first installment of the trilogy, but I do plan to work my way through all three games so I can give a thorough review of what I felt after playing all three of them in 2025, and whether its divisive reputation is truly deserved. Now, if you prefer to skip straight to the final verdict, feel free to use this timestamp right here. But without further ado, let's start by discussing why people dislike Final Fantasy XIII in the first place. Depending on what you value in a JRPG, some of these complaints may hit hard, while to others they may not even matter at all. Let's start with the biggest criticism of Final Fantasy XIII, its linear structure. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat this at all. This is easily one of the most linear games I've ever played in my entire life. There is virtually no room for exploration. The game funnels you down a single path, and whenever a side route appears, it almost always leads to a treasure chest. While the open world exploration does eventually open up, if you place a heavy value on exploration, chances are you're not going to make it that far in the game to experience it, because it is pretty deep within the game. And so if you're a person who puts a lot of stock and value into that, I feel like you are not going to like Final Fantasy XIII. The sense of linearity also goes beyond just the map design. NPC interactions, towns, and traditional side quests feel like an afterthought, stripping away much of the immersion and things that fans loved about previous Final Fantasy games. Even the leveling system is very restricted and linear. You're going to be gated by story progression and how far you can develop your character, and which paradigms, and think of these paradigms as character classes, and we're going to discuss them in even more detail later, but you're also gated in which character classes you're able to invest in. While you can eventually unlock all paradigms, like I said, these are classes for each character, the system strongly encourages you to stick to the initial three that the game assigns you, as branching out and using other paradigms becomes significantly more expensive, and it just doesn't become a viable option. Sticking to the main three that the game assigns for each character is what makes the most sense logically, and it's cheaper, so it incentivizes you to do that. And so this limits flexibility compared to systems like Final Fantasy X Sphere Grid, where you could essentially customize party roles more freely and get into the nitty-gritty. With exploration, side quests, and character progression feeling so constrained, Final Fantasy XIII's structure can seem like a steep backward step for the franchise. We saw the game progress so far and just have this vast open world with Final Fantasy X. We saw it be reiterated in Final Fantasy XII, and so it feels kind of weird to see it be pulled back so far with Final Fantasy XIII, and I think that was one jarring complaint for fans. Now, this complaint really didn't bother me that much because I don't put a lot of emphasis into those things. My emphasis mainly goes into, am I enjoying the combat? Do I like the characters? And am I sold with the story? And so I feel like a lot of times that linear map design kind of played in my favor to things that I like, because it got me straight to the next main story beat, as opposed to having a super long distance with things to do in between before I get to that. It just fed me straight to the next story scenario, boom, 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 where I was being fed the story very quickly and well paced. Now, one of the complaints that hit me the hardest, like I just mentioned, I put a lot of value into the story. Final Fantasy XIII has an extremely confusing story that's hard to keep up with. From the very start, you're bombarded with terms like l'Cie, fal'Cie, Seath, with little to no explanation, and you're just like, what are we even talking about? Like, what in the actual fuck is happening? While the game does eventually clarify things, I found myself constantly checking the in-game data logs, and even sometimes going to external sources to get things explained to me, just so that way I can keep up with what's going on in the story. Some of these things are explained, but they're explained once and they just expect you to memorize the terms going forward. And that's where I mentioned you have to constantly keep checking the in-game data log so that we can be like, okay, this is what I thought it was, but this sounds like Seath sounds similar to l'Cie. Like, what are we doing? But in the next segment, I'm gonna break down the story with a simple primer to help make sense of it all and explain some of these more complicated terms. So that way, when you're going into the game, you can just enjoy it and already have an understanding, as opposed to eventually figuring it out and then having to backtrack and try and make sure that you are on top of what is actually going on in the story. In exchange for that though, if you're enjoying the content, I really would appreciate it if you help me get this video to 100 likes and consider subscribing for more JRPG content like this. Okay, first let's go ahead and break down some of the complex terminology that you're gonna frequently hear throughout your entire journey of Final Fantasy 13 before we get into a little bit of a story preview, because it's gonna make more sense. First up, we have the term fal'Cie, and these are gonna be powerful godlike entities that belong to one of the two factions. We have Cocoon fal'Cie and we have Pulse fal'Cie. The Cocoon fal'Cie sustain life on Cocoon, which is gonna be the floating world above, which is the native world to the main cast. Next, we have the Pulse fal'Cie, and these are gonna be fal'Cie that reside on Grand Pulse, which is a world beneath Cocoon that everyone fears. So when you hear terms like Cocoon fal'Cie or Pulse fal'Cie, they simply just refer to the beings and the faction that they belong to. The next word you're gonna hear thrown around a lot is gonna be l'Cie, and these are humans who have been chosen or cursed, depending on how you view it, by a fal'Cie, which is gonna be the god entities that we just discussed, to complete a task known as a focus. And a focus is essentially a secret mission that the l'Cie have to do, and if they succeed, they're gonna be turned into crystals, supposedly gaining eternal life. Now, if you fail, you become a Seath, which is another terminology you hear, and these are just gonna be mindless monsters doomed to wander around forever. Now, this explanation should help you navigate the game's early hours with these terms that are thrown around with little explanation. So now let's move into a preview of the story, which is going to be spoilerless, so you can see what you can expect. The game opens up in a technologically advanced world of Cocoon, and this is going to be where all of the main party are native to and where they live at, and the ruling government, which is known as the Sanctum, has ordered a mass purge of civilians who've come in contact with an artifact from Pulse. As I mentioned, Pulse is the world beneath Cocoon that everyone on Cocoon fears. And so these civilians, they believe, have come into contact with this artifact, and so they want to get rid of all of them, just cutthroat. They all need to go, so that way we can protect the world of Cocoon. The people of Cocoon have been raised to fear Pulse, believing that any connection to it is dangerous, so the civilians who aren't affected by this are in support of the purging because they've been kind of brainwashed to fear Pulse. Now, during the chaos of the purge of civilians who've come into contact with that Pulse artifact, Lightning, who is our main character, a former soldier, begins to rebel against the government of Cocoon. In order to save her sister, Lightning's sister is branded to be a Pulse l'Cie, which, like I said, is the humans who are branded and set on a mission to achieve their focus. And with Lightning's sister being branded as a Pulse l'Cie, this marks her as an enemy of Cocoon because everyone in Cocoon fears any connection to the world down beneath them Pulse. So as the events of the purge unfold within the first few chapters, Lightning and a group of Cocoon natives come into contact with that same Pulse fal'Cie that branded Lightning's sister Sarah. And that Pulse fal'Cie brands the entire party to become Pulse l'Cie as well. Now, all of them who are branded as Pulse l'Cie are now considered traitors, and they must evade the government while uncovering the mystery of their assigned focus. But that kind of sets the stage of the journey that is Final Fantasy 13, only including the first two chapters. Now, going into Final Fantasy 13, I had zero expectations. Based on what I had heard, I was bracing myself for this to be the most shittiest game I've ever played in my life in every way, shape, or form based on the rhetoric surrounding the game. But personally, that hasn't been my experience at all. From the very first cutscene that I saw, I just kept thinking, I can't believe this game was released in 2009. The cinematics were absolutely stunning, and it's not just a handful of high quality cutscenes. Every major cutscene from start to finish is on par or better than a lot of modern JRPGs today. That being said though, the writing, especially early on, leaves a lot to be desired. Now, Snow, Vanille, and Hope in the first half of the game are some of the most annoying characters you will ever meet in a JRPG. Now, seeing Snow for the first time with the do-rag, the dirty trench coat, I was like, oh shit, like he's about to get active. He's gonna be one of those as I play the game. But once I started to hear himself continuously say the word hero, the 100th time, I was just so triggered that I was like, I never want to see Snow on my screen again. Just remove him. Give me everyone else, remove Snow. He's starting to piss me off. And then you have Vanille, who just has like this Elmo English voice actor. It's like, oh, hey guys, let's go. And like, she just has this annoying English voice actor that is just like, oh my God, why is she here? But that being said though, I do think these characters were intentionally designed and written to be so annoying, so that way their development would be felt more significantly later on. Like, you're gonna see the clear drastic change between them being annoying as shit to seeing the development and kind of the flaws and the ways that they are presented at the beginning of the game. And so after the first few hours, they'll gradually start to become more tolerable. Snow stops saying hero, and eventually he does start to grow on you, as well as the other two. So I can say that eventually you will become fully invested in the entire cast, and you won't just have that favorite like a lot of people where it's just, I just care about Lightning and Sarah's storyline, everyone else can kind of fuck off. Eventually they'll grow on you. Now, I do have a coworker who's an avid Final Fantasy 13 hater, so for this video I probed him a little bit more on his opinion to understand why. The main point that he constantly reiterated was that none of the main cast was likable outside of Lightning, and Lightning was just female Cloud. And so with that, I would say take a lot of this opinion with a grain of salt, because he quit after the first difficulty spike, similar to a lot of Final Fantasy 13 haters. And if you quit at this point in time, you never make it to the point of the game where you start to see some of the redeemable features for some of the more annoying characters in the cast in the early game. You never make it to the point where you start to like them. I do, however, still feel that they could have achieved that same character growth that I mentioned, that I believe that this annoyingness was intentionally. I feel like they could have achieved that same character growth without making them so annoying in the beginning. If the rumors about Final Fantasy 13, the trilogy being remastered, reported, turn out to be true, this is one aspect I hope they tweak in order to modernize the storytelling and make the character growth feel more natural. Now we can finally talk about the combat in Final Fantasy 13, which to me is a massive standout feature of the game. Final Fantasy 13 does, however, have several abrupt difficulty spikes that, if you're not fluent in the combat system, will likely lead to you being permanently stuck and eventually quitting the game. There are a few combat quirks that aren't explained by the game systems with the paradigm shift and the summons that are going to help you bypass those difficulty spikes though, which I'm going to explain a little bit later. But before I do, let's go ahead and start with some of the core mechanics. Final Fantasy 13 uses an evolved version of the ATB system, and so instead of selecting commands for each turn like we've seen in previous Final Fantasy games, an action gauge is going to fill up, and once it's full, you're going to be able to select different actions to execute them in sequence. Each character has an ATB bar that's going to be divided into different segments, and different abilities are going to consume a varying amount of those ATB segments. Unlike previous Final Fantasy games, you're only going to be able to control the party leader, while AI is going to control the other two members. Now, I don't view that as a downside, because the AI teammates are going to be extremely competent and intelligent, and they're going to be able to adapt and adjust based on the situation. I haven't had any problems with them just acting stupid and not doing what I needed them to. So you are able to manually input the different actions you want to use, but you're primarily going to be using the auto battle feature, which is going to select the optimal actions for your character to execute based on the situation. Some people think this system is going to be a dumbed down version of the combat since it's auto featured, but I feel like the real depth of Final Fantasy 13's combat is going to lie on when and how you use your paradigm shifts, rather than spending so much time managing your individual attacks. Now let's go ahead and discuss the paradigm shift system, which is going to pretty much be the bulk of your focus when you're in combat. Since you can't micromanage every action of each character, a lot of the strategy in Final Fantasy 13 revolves around paradigm shifts, which allow you to change your character's role instantly to suit the flow of battle. Think of this like a job system, but instead of switching jobs outside of battle, you're going to be able to do them in combat on the fly. So this is the menu where you can set up your AI deck, so that way when you go into battle, you'll have these list of options. These are also customizable, so I can select all of these different classes that I can have Lightning running as I play through the game, and I can customize this deck to be whatever fits my playstyle. Knowing which paradigm to be in and knowing when to shift is going to be key to winning battles. I hinted at it earlier, so now let's get into some tech that the game doesn't explain to you. It's going to help you win battles much easier and faster. At the beginning of every battle, no matter what, unless you get a preemptive strike, you're going to want a paradigm shift immediately, because the first paradigm shift animation is significantly longer than the subsequent animations. So you want to get that long shift animation out of the way so that way when you're rapidly shifting in battle, you can do it more instantaneously and take less damage from the enemies. The next hidden tech is that if you wait for your ATB gauge to fill, which you can see right here, and then attack, immediately after, if you paradigm shift after your attack concludes, your party is going to have a full ATB gauge ready for another attack. So the tech generally is to paradigm shift immediately after any attack where you waited for the ATB gauge to fill. With this strategy, you're going to significantly increase your damage output, making a lot of the more difficult bosses easier, because essentially you're getting double the value for waiting one time for the ATB gauge to fill. I know a lot of players don't know this because I don't believe the game explains it to you. So a lot of times you'll find people attacking, waiting for the ATB gauge to fill, attacking again, waiting for the ATB gauge to fill. So you're essentially doing half the damage since you're only getting one attack execution with each ATB gauge fill. Now with this strategy, it's going to be okay for you to run duplicates of the same paradigm, so that way you can shift and still have all of the party members doing the same role as they were previously. So here you'll see that I'm running 2 relentless assaults, so I can continuously swap between the 2 to get maximum damage without shifting the way that the rest of my party fights, because I'm shifting the paradigms. Once you get the hang of the combat system, it really is a standout feature, and I feel like this paradigm shift mechanic plays a major part in making combat feel fast-paced and also strategic. Next, we're going to talk about the stagger mechanic, and this little bar right here is going to be the most important thing you need to keep track of when you're in combat and you want to take down bosses. HP doesn't matter at all. You need to be paying attention to this stagger bar right here. And so you're going to be able to fill this up by repeatedly attacking with Ravagers. Once staggered, enemies are going to take a massively increased amount of damage, and each additional attack you do is going to increase that damage multiplier. Combining this with the paradigm shift strategy that I mentioned in the last section is going to be how you're going to dish out the maximum amount of damage. A lot of the bosses are going to be nearly impossible to defeat without staggering them first, so I put a lot of emphasis into this mechanic. I wouldn't really even focus on enemy HP because a lot of it is going to be depleted significantly faster once you stagger the enemy. Next is going to be the summons, and each character is going to get an Eidolon, and that's going to be a powerful summon that they can call into battle. These summons aren't really game breaking, they're more of like an emergency tool rather than like a guaranteed win button. And a hidden tech with the summons is that if you use your summon while your party is dead, when your summon leaves, everyone in the party is going to be revived once it's finished. So that's going to be the ins and outs of combat in Final Fantasy 13 for you to become fluid and make sure every battle is a piece of cake for you. And that hidden tech, man, like that is just such a game changer. And I feel like that is going to help you overcome those difficulty spikes when you start your journey. Now let's talk about the Crystarium system, which is going to be how you level your character and how you progress them. And this is where a lot of the complaints that I mentioned earlier were, because they feel like this is linear. So the game essentially assigns you 3 classes when you first start the game. Eventually you'll unlock the rest, but they just become unviable because of how expensive they are to level up. So basically, to be maximum efficient, you're going to need to level up the 3 classes that the game recommends you at the start, and eventually you're going to be able to level them all up and have enough points. You can think of this as working similar to Final Fantasy X Sphere Grid, except for it's going to be way less dynamic and more linear. Defeating enemies is going to give you CP, and you're going to be able to take that CP into this system to invest to get different stats as well as abilities for the different classes that you have with your paradigms. Now, a lot of this is going to be gated and tied to main story events, so you may hit a point where you can't go further in your synergist paradigm, and you're going to have to progress further in the story to unlock the rest. And that's going to be when you're going to want to leave here and invest in the other 3 paradigms that the game gives you at the start, so that way you can get the other stat buffs. Maybe you don't plan to run that character within that paradigm, but you're going to want to get these different stat buffs to make your character stronger, so that way you're not under leveled, because this is going to be essentially the leveling system. Another thing worth mentioning is that Saz is going to get haste probably the fastest out of anyone in the cast, and then Hope gets haste as well, but that's a little bit later in his progression than you get it with Saz. Haste is going to be extremely helpful because it allows your ATB gauge to fill up a lot quicker, and you're filling it up quicker, which means you can do the paradigm shift tech a lot more since that gauge is filling up manually quicker, and you're going to be able to significantly increase your damage output once you get haste on Saz, and then eventually with Hope. The OST for Final Fantasy 13 is just banger after banger after banger. The way that I judge this is if I find myself with these songs stuck in my head, and I don't get annoyed throughout the entire course of the game and I'm not like, please stop the music, that's how I know that this shit is hitting. And there are a few tracks, I believe Blinded by the Light is the battle OST, and throughout the entire journey of the game, I never got annoyed by it, and I found myself just humming like it's gonna be stuck in your head, and it's just a banger of a soundtrack. And then we have another one when things kind of slow down a little bit, and I believe this one is called The Promise. And this slow melody with the lyrics above it, like with the woman singing it, oh my god, it's just so chef's kissed, and it's just like and oh my god, they're all stuck in my head. I could sit here and talk about the music so long, but I'm sure a lot of you don't care. But for those that do, you're not going to be disappointed with this one. The soundtrack is going to be definitely one of the standout features of the game. My final verdict on Final Fantasy XIII is that if you're someone who values open world exploration and being immersed in the game's side activities, this isn't going to be the game for you. If you can overlook its linear structure, I feel like this is an amazing game with fast-paced combat, memorable music, and visuals that are better than a lot of the JRPGs being released today. The story can be a bit difficult to keep up with, but once you start to understand the core terminology used in the story, it's going to grow on you and it's going to hook you. This is one game throughout the course of a trilogy, and I'm only focusing on just this one game, but I know the foundation being built in this first installment of the trilogy is going to lead to the story in the other two games getting better and better. The combat does have abrupt difficulty spikes, but after watching this video, that shouldn't be an issue for you because I explained some of the hidden tech that the game doesn't explain that makes combat way smoother, and it makes these difficulty spikes less apparent. Now, if you're still considering another Final Fantasy game, feel free to check out this video right here where I go into if Final Fantasy 15 is going to be worth it in 2025. Thank you for your time, and I'll catch you in the next one.